Members, the vote is 52 in favour, 11 absent. The vote is carried. Motion is carried.
Mr. Speaker, I would like you to invite the Minister of Justice. He will take the amendments, I think about 9, on the Child Diversion Act 2018.
Mr. Speaker, I now ask for your consent that the Senate amendments to the bill shortly entitled the Child Diversion Act 2018 be now considered and approved.
Mr. Speaker, at an appropriate time today, Mr. Speaker, I ask for a recommittal to allow the minister to deal with the bills brought from the Senate, the amendments brought from the Senate, for it to be considered and approved.
The motion is that we recommit bills brought from the Senate. Those in favour?
Aye.
Those against? Ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I now ask for your consent that the Senate amendments...
Mr. Chuck.
Oh, gosh.
Sorry. The following is a message from the President of the Senate to the Honourable House of Representatives. I have the honour to advise the Honourable House of Representatives that on the 13th day of July 2018, a bill entitled An Act to Facilitate the Implementation of Child Diversion in the Criminal Justice System and for Connected Matters was passed in the Senate with 13 amendments, for which the Honourable Senate desires the concurrence of this Honourable House. The amendments have been duly circulated. Signed, Thomas Tavares, Vincent QC, CDJP, President of the Senate.
Mr. Speaker, I now ask for your consent that the Senate amendments to the bill shortly entitled the Child Diversion Act 2018 be now considered and approved. Mr. Speaker, the amendments have been circulated. My learned friend from South St. Andrew pointed out a very important what I would consider, Mr. Speaker, a editorial error. If we look at section 9, in clause 9.1, it was intended that the phrase in the parish in which the offense was committed or in the parish in which the child resides, that should have been put to clause 37. But when we look in the bill before us, as printed, we notice that a part of the phrase in the parish, that is the 5th line, in the parish in which the offense was committed, still remains. So we are going to consider it to be an editorial amendment and delete that phrase in there. With that, Mr. Speaker, because it was intended to go to clause 37, which is part of the amendment proposed. According to Mr. Speaker, most of the other amendments are more editorial and grammatical errors. So in the circumstances, Mr. Speaker, I ask the House to support the amendments proposed by the Senate.
Those in favour? Those against? Ayes have it. Amendment approved. Mr. Samuda.
The Minister of Science and Technology will now deal with the Telecommunications Spectrum Regulation Fees Validation and Indemnity Act 2018.
Dr. Weekly.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The bill before us today is a short one and involves validating and confirming the actions of the Spectrum Management Authority, the authority. Mr. Speaker, as you are aware, the Spectrum Management Authority is the regulator with responsibility for managing the radio frequency spectrum. In keeping with the provisions of the Telecommunications Act, spectrum users are required to pay regulatory fees to cover the reasonable operating costs incurred by the authority in the exercise of its functions. Mr. Speaker, the first regulatory fee mechanism was developed in 2003. As a result of which, Mr. Speaker, a formula was developed to calculate the regulatory fees which would be levied against spectrum users whose business activities depend solely on the use of the spectrum, also referred to as Group 2 Level 1 users. For example, Mr. Speaker, users such as mobile operators. However, Mr. Speaker, in this formula, the annual operating budget of the authority was denoted by a fixed figure of $44 million. Mr. Speaker, since the cost of regulation increased annually, a year after those regulations were passed, Mr. Speaker, the formula became obsolete. Mr. Speaker, to address this issue and after consultation with the telecommunication operators who would be affected, the authority increased the annual operating budget in the formula consistent with the level of inflation as determined by the Statistical Institute of Jamaica for the previous year. Mr. Speaker, this practice was undertaken from 2004 until the new regulations. Mr. Speaker, you and the members of this Honourable House would recall that in the new regulations, the previous practice of the authority was formalized, so that the formula for Group 2 Level 1 users of the spectrum, the budget of the authority is now, Mr. Speaker, determined by a figure which is increased annually by the rate of inflation. Mr. Speaker, notwithstanding the fact that the telecommunication operators who were affected by the increased fees concurred in the calculation and imposition of the same, the authority, Mr. Speaker, still calculated, imposed, and collected fees which were in excess of the sum imposed by the regulations previously approved by this Honourable House. Consequently, Mr. Speaker, the bill before us seeks to validate and confirm as valid, proper, and lawful the calculation, imposition, and collection of those fees, and indemnify the government and all persons associated with the calculation, imposition, and collection of those fees from liability. Mr. Speaker, in reviewing this short bill clause by clause, Clause 1 of the bill, Mr. Speaker, is the short title. Clause 2 of the bill provides a definition for the word authority. The definition here adopts, Mr. Speaker, the meaning of the word authority in the Telecommunications Act. That is the Spectrum Management Authority. Clause 3, Mr. Speaker, of the bill provides for the validation of the actions undertaken by the authority and frees, acquits, discharges, and indemnifies anyone who is liable to be proceeded against from liability. Mr. Speaker, in addition, while there are none, out of an abundance of caution, this clause, Mr. Speaker, also saves any payments which are due to the authority during the period in question by providing that unpaid regulatory fees validated by the bill remain due and payable. Mr. Speaker, I therefore recommend that this bill to this Honourable House for its consideration.
Mr. Paulwell.
Mr. Speaker, my colleague, the member from Southeast St. Andrew, is the Shadow Cabinet Minister who deals with this area. He's unfortunately not here, but it's not unfamiliar matter for me, and certainly we would support this bill, which is really seeking to validate charges, revenues derived from the operators before and now. And so it could not be a problem. But there are some questions I'd like to raise, because the regulatory fees are based on the revenue that is necessary to enable the Spectrum Management Authority to operate. And so we anticipate, and the providers would anticipate every year a budget that is established. What I would like to know is, how is it determined per provider? That is it, and I'm probably trying to refresh my own memory, whether it is per subscriber or per revenues, gross or net. If you could just remind us the basis on which each provider is charged a regulatory fee. Mr. Speaker, in the same way, as you know, there are other fees that the providers do pay in relation to the use of the spectrum. We're talking about license fees. And these, in relation to, for example, the cell operators, they pay a license fees once every 15 years based on the validity of the license. I know that some fees were worked out recently, I think 3 or 4 years, 4 or 5 years ago. And I would like to get an update as to what has been collected from the major users, just to make sure that that is being kept based on a schedule that was developed then. And finally, Mr. Speaker, we have a liberalized telecommunications sector in Jamaica, and we are proud of that. But one of the aims of liberalization was to enable us to allow the market to almost regulate itself because of the intensity of competition. It was our aim that the current situation that now obtains, Mr. Speaker, where you have the OUR as a regulator and it charges a fee. You have the Spectrum Management Authority, a regulator, charges a fee. You have the Broadcasting Commission as well. And all three of them, Mr. Speaker, do charge fees of one kind or the other. This was not the intention. And the aim was eventually for us to have a single regulator, one with the requisite expertise in-house that could deal with all areas of regulating this industry. We have been fighting turf wars for many years to achieve a single regulator. I would like the Minister to apprise us as to where we are now with that process that I think all of us are agreed on must happen if we're going to have a sector that the investors can feel confident in as being one of certainty, one with the requisite experience, but very importantly, the removal of the bureaucracy that get in the way of business. So I'd like the Minister to provide us with information as to when are we going to get to the point of a single regulator, and whether or not a decision has been taken as to where that office will be. Of course, it was always my view that it should be properly placed at the Spectrum Management Authority, but I don't know if there has been any change in the thinking. Those are my comments, Mr. Speaker, but we have no objections to the bill.
Minister Wheatley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As it relates to the matter of the single ICT regulator, the member, and I'm sure the House, will agree with me that with the convergence of technology, the need for a single ICT regulator becomes even more pronounced or important for us to move in that direction. In fact, we have seen where in other jurisdictions, the way they have moved to implement a single ICT regulator. The matter is currently before Cabinet for us to, well, it is there now. In fact, I was the one that brought it to Cabinet's attention, for us to create a single ICT regulator. And so we are still deliberating on that. We are going through a process of consultations with the other entities. In fact, quite a number of entities, as you stated earlier, they all collect fees and are trying to keep as much of those fees and have their own independence. But the truth is, it is more than overdue for us to move towards implementing a single ICT regulator. And it's just a cleaner way of managing the sector with the convergence of technology. As it relates to license fees, I'll have to provide the amount that is collected on an annual basis. As a matter of fact, I believe that it is stated in the budget as to the actual amount of money expected to be collected annually. But from the different operators, that is something that I'll have to furnish you with at a later date. Just to inform you as well, member, that all fees as relates to spectrum license and regulatory fees for the major holders are up to date. And of course, as I promised you, I'll provide you with the actual figure if you need it at a later date. And I'm sure you are also aware about seeing that you want the reminder that the spectrum regulatory fees are charged based on the amount of spectrum held and the value of the spectrum. In fact, I think I should use this opportunity to indicate that we have also put in place a spectrum cap, a revised spectrum cap, to ensure that we do not have a situation where we have hoard in our spectrum which will discourage or prevent other entrants from participating in this sector. I believe, member, I would have answered all your questions. Have I forgotten any, member? All right, thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, I would like to use the opportunity to ask that the bill be read a second time.
The second, please, are you going to? The clerk will not read this. Minister, you move that the bill be read a second time. Okay. Those in favor? Those against? As of it. Sorry.
A bill entitled an act to validate and confirm as lawful the imposition, calculation and collection of spectrum regulatory fees in good faith and inadvertent as to the imposition, calculation and collection of such fees being invalid, improper or without lawful authority during the period commencing on the 1st day of April 2004 and ending on the 22nd day of March 2017 to indemnify the government and all other persons from liability in relation thereto and for connected matters. Read a second time.
The House will now resolve itself into a committee of the whole House to consider the bill clause by clause. Minister, you have any amendment? No, I put clause 1. Those in favor? Those against? As of it. I put clause 2. Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it. I put clause 3. Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it. I put the preamble of the bill. Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it. I put the title and the enacting clause. Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it. The question is that I do report the bill as having passed committee stage without amendment. Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it. So on a lazy. I do report that the bill having passed committee stage without amendment. Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I now ask that the bill be read a third time.
The question is that the bill be read a third time. Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it.
A bill entitled an act to validate and confirm as lawful the imposition, calculation, and collection of spectrum regulatory fee in good faith and inadvertent as to the imposition, calculation, and collection of such fees being invalid, improper, or without lawful authority during the period commencing on the 1st day of April 2004 and ending on the 22nd day of March 2017, to indemnify the government and all other persons from liability in relation thereto, and for connected matters read a third time and passed.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Industry, Commerce, Agriculture and Fisheries will bring down the curtain today by taking the conch export levy rate of levy order 2016 resolution. Mr. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before this Honourable House is the conch export levy rate of levy order 2018 resolution and the conch export levy rate of levy order 2018. You will recall that the Conch Export Levy Act was passed in 2009. The main purpose of this act is to impose a levy on each pound of conch exported during each conch season, and this is pursuant to Section 3 of the Act. All proceeds of the levy are by law allocated to the Fisheries Management and Development Fund, which is used to facilitate the sustainable management and development of the fisheries sector pursuant to Section 9 of the Act. The levy for the 2017 conch season was set at 50 cents in the currency of the United States of America per pound of conch. It is therefore recommended that the levy remain as such for the 2018 conch season. Accordingly, this Honourable House is being asked to affirm the rate of levy prescribed for the 2018 conch season being 50 cents in the currency of the United States of America per pound. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Dr. Ferguson.
Expansion dealing with aquaculture, etc. However, Mr. Speaker, a number of fisher folks, in spite of the fact that we are getting development from, in some instances, from this cess, which is bringing in about $400,000 US per, well, last year certainly, and has the potential to grow. But there's the issue relative to issues that they are having, the challenges, because while you are paying the 50 cents, which I am happy to see remain the same this year, the expenses, the cost of operation keep moving, but there is no discussion with the industry as to how we review the industry from time to time, taking into account the hardships that they face relative to having to pay the cess. Because again, Minister, what our local fisher folks in that sense face is that with poaching, you have persons coming in from other jurisdictions, taking away our conch, paying no cess, while they have to be paying the cess. And from my research, I think Jamaica might be one of the few countries that charge a cess on export of conch. So it is something we have to look at. I know that the former minister in agriculture had moved the cess down, had made some, and had promised to some extent that he would have continued to review to see how we take into account the hardships, the challenges that the industry face. So while we support, there are issues that I would want to discuss with you when next we meet in a briefing session.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member. And certainly will give him the undertaking that it's something I fully intend to look into more deeply, and we'll have further discussions with him as well. It is a fact that we have to look more carefully at the illegal fishing in our waters for conch and other things. And of course, at the same time, we too will have to, as I've said in discussion on the fisheries bill, that we also have to look now more concretely at how we can exploit the blue economy in a more fundamental way. But certainly, I think that this matter is up for review, and I give that undertaking to the Honourable House. So I move for the approval of this order, Mr. Speaker.
The motion is that the conch export levy rate of levy order 2018 be affirmed. Those in favour? Those against? As of it.
Mr. Speaker, it is not intended to do any further business today, but as we bring this session of Parliament to a close, I'm sure, confident in the knowledge that this Parliament has undertaken some very constructive work over the past couple of months. We will not be convening Parliament over the next few weeks, as it is customary to go on summer break at this time. I wish for everyone, and especially the staff and members who have given of themselves so fulsomely over this period, working late into the night, but achieving a lot on behalf of the people of Jamaica. I wish everyone a very pleasant and refreshing holiday. Come back fully charged and ready to take up where we shall have left off at the end of this session, Mr. Speaker. It is my wish that this Honourable House be now adjourned for a date to be fixed.
Mr. Paulwell.
Mr. Speaker, I join with my colleague, the Leader of Government Business, in also extending to the staff, firstly, of this Parliament, a well-deserved break for the summer, and also to the colleagues as well. Mr. Speaker, I would like to encourage, if possible, and I side with my colleague, the member from South East St. Andrew, if during this break we could try and achieve two things to make life a little better for us inside this chamber. One, if we can get an improvement in the Wi-Fi capacity. it is really quite inadequate for members of this chamber to operate in this day and age where you have to be connected. Wi-Fi is a necessity. And I'm going to urge that during this period, we upgrade the system in the Parliament to enable real broadband. And if it has to be curtailed to the members, then there's nothing wrong in enabling each of us to have a password. But what we have now is totally unacceptable in this day and age. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, I would also like to see if we could do something with the electrical configuration. There's no reason why a member should have to be wandering all over the place to plug in his or her phone or computer. This is the information age. We need to be able to have easy access to the electrical circuit at our feet. At our feet. No. Mr. Speaker, we will bring our placards if we have to wait for a new parliament for this. So I'm urging that during this period, we could do these necessary changes to make life better for all of us. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Members, I want to promise you I will take steps to see that some things are done better. The motion is that this House be adjourned for a date to be fixed. Those in favor? Those against? As the Honorable House now stands adjourned.